In August of 1838, New Orleans officials quietly recorded something that should not have been possible. 3 enslaved women, owned by 3 different men, gave birth within the same week. All 3 infants had pale skin. One had light brown hair. One had blue eyes. Doctors wrote the same word in all 3 ledgers: anomaly. What they did not write was where the babies went. By December of that same year, 17 white passing infants had vanished from slave records, removed, renamed, and resold into white families across Louisiana and Mississippi. The white society of New Orleans whispered about miracles, curses, and miscegenation, but they had no idea the truth was far worse. By 1845, over 70 children born enslaved would legally exist as white. What really happened inside the slave quarters along the Mississippi River? Who decided which babies disappeared, and which mothers were silenced forever? And what did one enslaved woman do in 1842 that terrified everyone who witnessed it? Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. Now let me take you back to where it all began. In August of 1838, New Orleans woke beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, the kind that pressed low against the city and trapped heat, sound, and secrets alike. The Mississippi moved slowly that morning, thick and brown, carrying flatboats heavy with cotton bales, sugar crates, and human cargo. From the riverfront up through the French Quarter and into the narrow streets where slave pens hid behind respectable facades, the city breathed as it always had, humid, indulgent, and cruelly efficient. The auction bell rang just after sunrise. Men in linen coats gathered beneath striped awnings, fanning themselves with ledgers and folded newspapers. Horses stamped. Enslaved men and women stood barefoot on packed dirt, their skin already slick with sweat. Buyers inspected teeth, shoulders, hands. A woman was told to turn slowly. She obeyed. Another was ordered to lift her dress hem to show her calves. She hesitated. A whip cracked the air, not striking flesh, only reminding it what would happen next. New Orleans liked to imagine itself different from Charleston, from Natchez, from the inland plantations. It called itself cosmopolitan, civilized, a place of music and wine and tolerance. There were free people of color here, educated men, women who owned property, tailors and carpenters whose skin tone allowed them to exist in a narrow space between slavery and whiteness. White society pointed to that and said, "See, we are not like the others." What they did not say was how carefully those boundaries were policed. Inside the parish clerk's office on Chartres Street, the air smelled of ink, dust, and old paper. Ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, doing little more than moving warm air from one corner to another. Baptismal records lay open on long tables. Births, deaths, marriages, names that determine futures. A clerk dipped his pen and frowned at the page before him. "This one again," he said quietly. Across the table, a physician removed his gloves. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. "Yes," he replied. "This one." The clerk glanced toward the open window, then back at the ledger. "That makes 3 this month." "Say nothing of it," the doctor said. "Write what we discussed." The pen hovered. Ink threatened to fall. What if someone asks? No one will. The clerk wrote anyway. Outside, church bells rang. Somewhere, a woman screamed in labor. The city had rules about bodies. It measured them, priced them, recorded their existence with meticulous care. An enslaved person was inventory, a line item in an account book. Their births were assets. Their deaths were losses. Their children belonged, by law, to the man who owned the mother. That certainty kept the system upright. It kept the market clean. Which was why what began happening that summer unsettled even men who believed themselves immune to doubt. On a sugar plantation upriver, an enslaved woman named Eliza bent low over cane rows, her back aching, her abdomen heavy with child. She had known this day would come long before the first pains. The overseer had known too. He had watched her carefully these past months, noting her appetite, her pace, the way the other women glanced at her and then away. Nothing was said aloud. Nothing needed to be. "You slow," he told her one afternoon. "Yes, sir." "Best not disappoint me." She did not answer. Her hands shook slightly as she cut the cane. What Eliza did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that her pregnancy had already been discussed in a counting house in the city. Her body had been considered, assessed. The possible outcomes weighed. A child was coming. The question was not whether it would live. The question was what it would be. In the slave quarters at night, women spoke in murmurs. They shared bits of news passed from kitchen to yard, from dock to laundry line. "They watching us closer," one whispered. "They always watching," another replied. "No, the first said. Different now. A third woman sat apart, her hands resting on her belly. She said nothing. She was remembering the way the midwife's face had gone still during the last birth she attended, the silence that followed, the speed with which the baby had been taken away. At the auction house on Esplanade Avenue, a trader named Henri Duval reviewed his books. He was a careful man, known for discretion. His accounts were balanced to the penny. He made notes in the margins that no one else could read. More demand than supply, he muttered. His partner looked up. For what? Duval closed the book. For silence. Above them, in the upstairs rooms where deals were made behind locked doors, plans were already forming. Not plans born of impulse or lust, but of opportunity, profit, control. Because New Orleans understood something fundamental. Race was not merely inherited. It could be assigned. It could be sold. By the end of that year, white passing infants would begin appearing in homes far from the river. Children whose skin did not mark them, whose origins were buried beneath forged documents and polite lies. They would be called blessings, miracles, orphans saved from obscurity. None of them would know the truth. And the women who gave birth to them would learn, too late, that motherhood was a privilege the city could revoke without warning. This was the beginning. It did not look like violence yet. It looked like paperwork, like routine, like men dipping pens into ink and choosing which words to write and which lives to erase. And before the summer was over, New Orleans would discover that some records, once altered, could never be made right again. By September, the heat had turned watchful. It pressed against skin and lingered in doorways as if listening. In the quarters behind the big houses, where plank walls breathed at night and rats traced familiar paths, the women learned to measure their movements. Not because they had not always been measured, but because the measuring had changed. A woman named Celeste noticed it first. She worked in a kitchen off Royal Street, rising before dawn to grind coffee and light fires. She had learned long ago to keep her eyes lowered and her mouth still. Yet now, when she crossed the courtyard, she felt the pause. The moment when a man's gaze lingered too long, not with hunger exactly, but calculation. How far along? The cook asked one morning, voice flat. Celeste did not answer at first. Her hand rested at her side, fingers curled, nails biting into her palm. 6 months, she said. The cook nodded once. They will start counting now. Counting had always been part of it. The women knew the rules even if no one explained them. When the bleeding stopped, eyes followed. When the belly rounded, questions came. Overseers marked calendars with chalk. Mistresses noticed the way dresses strained. Midwives were summoned earlier, watched more closely. This time, though, the watching had teeth. On a plantation near Algiers Point, an enslaved woman named Ruth was brought out of the fields before midday. The overseer spoke softly, which was how she knew it was bad. "Doctor coming?" he said. "You stay put." She sat on a crate in the shade while white men spoke in low voices nearby. One of them gestured toward her abdomen without touching it, as if afraid the act itself might contaminate him. "What if it happens again?" one asked. "It will not," another replied. "And if it does, we are prepared." Ruth understood only one word clearly. Prepared. What none of the women could have articulated, though they felt it in the tightening of their chests, was that their bodies were no longer simply laboring bodies. They had become sites of risk, variables in a system that demanded certainty. At night, they gathered when they could. In wash houses, in corners of yards, beneath the pretense of shared chores. "They took her baby," one said. "Where?" "No one knows. They say it was sick. They always say that." A woman named Amelie shook her head. "Sick babies do not get baptized." Silence followed. Then the smallest voice spoke. "They baptize them fast now." The women looked at the girl. She could not have been more than 15. She had been carrying water for the church, scrubbing floors where white families knelt and prayed. "How you know?" someone asked. "I saw the book," she said. The names were already written. Before the birth. That night, Celeste dreamed of ink running like blood. Meanwhile, in the city, records moved faster than people. A child born at dawn could be renamed by dusk. Parish registers were amended with careful hands. A stroke added. A line removed. The difference between enslaved and free reduced to a matter of penmanship. Inside a townhouse near St. Louis Cathedral, a woman in mourning black listened while a man explained. "You will receive the infant within the week," he said. "The circumstances are unfortunate." She pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "But the skin is a blessing," he interrupted. "One you would do well to accept without questions." She hesitated. "And the mother?" She has been compensated. The woman nodded, relief and something like shame passing over her face. Then God has provided. What she did not know was that the compensation had not gone to the mother. On the plantation upriver, Eliza's labor began just before a storm. Thunder rolled over cane fields. Rain came hard and sudden. The midwife arrived breathless, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone else. "Quiet now," she whispered. "Do what you must. Say nothing more." Eliza bit down on cloth to keep from crying out. Pain tore through her in waves that left her shaking. When the baby came, there was a moment, brief, fragile, where the world seemed to hold its breath. The midwife's hands froze. She did not smile. She did not curse. She wrapped the child quickly, too quickly, and turned away. "No," Eliza said, reaching. "Please." The door opened. Men entered. Not the overseer this time, but strangers. Clean boots. Dry coats. "Take her," one said. Eliza screamed then. Not words. Sound. What she did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that this scream would be remembered. It would echo years later in rooms where men insisted they had heard nothing at all. By the end of the month, the women understood something essential. Pregnancy was no longer merely dangerous. It was watched. And being watched meant choices were being made, far from their bodies, far from their voices, about who their children were allowed to become. They would learn soon enough how final those choices could be. The child was born before dawn, in a room that smelled of damp wood and iron. A single candle burned low on a crate near the bed, its flame bending whenever Eliza drew breath. Outside, rain tapped the shutters with a patient insistence, as if the storm had settled in to wait. The midwife's hands were steady. They always were. She had delivered more children than she could count, her palms mapped with scars and calluses earned in other people's pain. She had seen stillness where there should have been cries, cords wrapped too tight, lungs that never filled. She had learned not to hope. This time she faltered. The baby emerged slick and silent for a heartbeat too long. Eliza's fingers clawed at the blanket, her body shuddering as she waited for the sound that would tell her the child was alive. Then the cry came, thin, sharp, unmistakable. The midwife exhaled. She leaned closer. The candlelight slid across the infant's face, catching on skin that did not match the room, the mother, the night. "No," she whispered. Eliza lifted her head. "What?" The midwife wrapped the child quickly, turning it so the light would not fall full on the face. Too late. Eliza had already seen. The color. The fine hair pressed damp against the skull. "Let me hold her," Eliza said. The midwife hesitated. In that pause lived 1,000 calculations. Who would arrive first? What had been said? What would happen if she disobeyed? Eliza. The door opened. Boots crossed the threshold. 2 men entered without removing their hats. One carried a leather satchel. The other carried a folded paper stamped with a seal that caught the candlelight and reflected it coldly back. "We were told the child is born," the taller one said. Eliza screamed. She reached, her arms weak, her body still shaking from the effort of birth. "Please," she said. "Please." The man did not look at her. He nodded once at the midwife. "Proceed." The satchel opened. Inside were cloths, a bottle, a pen, and a small book already creased at the spine. The midwife's hands trembled as she placed the baby into the man's arms. The child cried again, louder now, offended by the transfer. For an instant that would haunt her, the midwife considered refusing, considered turning away, considered pretending she had not seen. Then she remembered the last woman who had refused. The door closed behind them. Eliza lay back, empty, her chest heaving. Milk came in before noon. Her body did not understand the absence. By the time the sun rose fully, the child no longer existed under Eliza's name. In the parish office, the doctor stood beside the clerk as the ink dried. "Sex?" the clerk asked. "Female." The pen scratched. "Mother?" The doctor paused. "Unknown." "What?" "Unknown," he repeated. The child was surrendered. Surrendered by whom? Circumstances. The clerk glanced up, but the doctor was already turning away. A new page was opened. A new name written. One chosen for its simplicity, its cleanliness, its ability to belong anywhere. Above the city, the bells rang again. News moved in murmurs. Through kitchens. Through dockside taverns. Through places where men spoke carefully and women listened harder. "They took the baby," someone said. "That one too." "Yes." "White." "So they say." In a townhouse near the river, a woman sat with the infant in her arms. She rocked gently, counting breaths. The baby's eyes were closed, lashes pale against flushed skin. "She will be called Clara," the woman said. Her husband stood near the window. "No one must ever know." Of course not. They would tell the neighbors she was an orphan. A charity case. A blessing delivered by God after years of waiting. They would never speak the other possibility aloud. Across the city, Eliza sat in the shade, her breasts bound tight with cloth. The pain was constant, a dull throb that reminded her with every movement. "They say the baby died," another woman told her. Eliza shook her head. "No. How you know?" "I heard her cry." That cry would follow her. It would follow others too. By the end of the week, 3 more births were recorded. 2 more infants removed. Each time the process grew smoother, faster, less room for hesitation. What none of the men involved acknowledged, though some felt it stirring like nausea, was that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The first removal had been justified as an exception, a mercy, a necessary correction. The second made it a solution. By the third, it had become a method. And methods, once proven profitable, demanded repetition. By winter, the city would pretend this had always been the way of things. But in that small room, with the candle burned low and the rain tapping patiently at the shutters, something had shifted. The system had learned it could remake a child. And it would not stop with just one. By October, the city no longer reacted. It adjusted. What had first unsettled clerks and midwives hardened into routine with the efficiency New Orleans applied to all profitable things. A pattern emerged, not announced, never written plainly, but understood by those who needed to understand. Certain doctors were summoned. Certain men arrived at births uninvited. Certain pages and certain ledgers were rewritten with quiet confidence. And certain babies disappeared. Inside a counting house on Magazine Street, Henri Duval sat with his partner, a man who preferred not to be named in public spaces. Shutters were drawn against the afternoon glare. The smell of tobacco and river damp clung to the air. "You are certain this is legal?" the partner asked. Duval did not look up from his books. "Legal enough. The law does not describe every child. Only categories. We are merely selecting the correct one." "And the mothers?" Duval closed the ledger. "Our property." The partner hesitated. "Some are beginning to notice." Duval allowed himself a thin smile. "They always notice. They never matter." What they were doing was not new in spirit. New Orleans had long traded in shades, of skin, of status, of belonging. The placage system already allowed white men to publicly acknowledge mixed-race children when it suited them, granting education or freedom while maintaining distance. What changed now was scale. This was not indulgence. It was infrastructure. At St. Augustine Church, Father Moreau held a baptismal register open while a woman in gloves watched closely. "You understand," she said, "that discretion is required." "Of course," he replied. He dipped his pen. The child slept in a basket nearby, unaware that water and ink were about to decide everything. "And the parents?" "Unknown," the woman said smoothly. "Found near the river." The priest's hand paused. He had performed 3 such baptisms this month alone. "God sees all," he murmured. "Yes," she said. "But people do not." Across town, brokers met behind closed doors. They discussed routes. Which families would accept a child quickly? Which states asked fewer questions? Which names carried no trace of origin? "Mississippi buyers are easier," one said. "But Louisiana families pay more." "They want miracles," another replied. "Children that fix things." The language was careful. They did not say white. They said unmarked, unburdened, suitable. By now, the enslaved women understood that something larger than any single plantation was unfolding. They saw the signs in small things, the speed with which men arrived, the way midwives avoided their eyes, the sudden disappearance of women who resisted. A woman named Amelie was sold south 2 days after refusing to release her child. She was trouble, the overseer said. The baby was gone by morning. In the quarters that night, Celeste spoke softly, her voice barely louder than breath. "They choosing them," she said. "Before they born." Ruth nodded. "I seen the list." "What list?" "At the big house. Names of women. Marks beside them." Silence followed. Then, "For what?" Ruth swallowed. "Skin. Hair. Who they been forced with." No one asked her how she knew that. In the city, doctors began to argue among themselves. Not about morality. About risk. "This cannot continue indefinitely," one said. "Eventually someone will talk." Duval shrugged. "They always do. We always silence them." And if a child grows and questions? They are white, Duval replied. They will be believed. What none of them could fully control, what stirred unease even in the most disciplined minds, was the mother's memory. Records could be altered, names reassigned, documents burned, but memory resisted. Eliza began to mark days. She used small scratches on a beam behind the quarters, counting time since the birth. Others began to do the same, though they did not speak of it. One night, a young woman asked, "What if we hide them?" Celeste shook her head. "They already know who they want." Another whispered, "Then what do we do?" No one answered. Above them, in parlors lit by oil lamps, white women rocked infants and spoke of providence. "She came to us," one said. "Yes," another agreed. "God chooses carefully." The men nodded and said nothing. By November, shipments moved upriver at night. Babies wrapped in fine cloth. Papers stamped and sealed. No cries. No witnesses. The city congratulated itself on maintaining order. What it did not see, what it refused to see, was that the system had grown too large to remain invisible. Every removal required cooperation. Every lie required another man willing to repeat it. Every prophet demanded silence from more mouths than silence could safely hold. And somewhere between the river and the records office, a woman was beginning to remember everything. Names, dates, faces. What they did not know was that memory, once sharpened, could become a weapon. And when the system finally faced resistance, it would not come from courts or churches. It would come from those it had dismissed as voiceless. By winter, the city would learn how dangerous that assumption had been. By December, the river ran colder, its surface dull and metallic beneath pale winter light. Fog settled low along the banks in the early mornings, swallowing sound and distance alike. In that quiet, the women began to change. Not loudly, not all at once, but in ways that unsettled the men who believed they understood obedience. It started with small refusals. A woman would delay answering when summoned. Another would feign illness on the night a doctor was expected. A third would move her sleeping place without permission, carrying her thin pallet to a corner where shadows gathered and walls listened. Celeste learned to read the signs in their bodies. The way a woman stood when her time was close. The tension in her shoulders. The way her hands never left her abdomen. "They coming tonight," Ruth whispered one evening, breath quick. "How you know?" "They washed the sheets." That was always the sign. The women gathered after dark beneath the pretense of mending clothes. Needles moved. Threads slid through fabric. The work gave their hands purpose while their minds raced. "If the baby looks wrong," one began. "Different," Celeste corrected. "If the baby looks different, they take it. And if it doesn't, they leave it. Then what do we do?" Silence pressed in. Outside, a dog barked once, then went quiet. A woman named Louisa spoke. She had lost 2 children already, one to fever, one to sail. Her eyes held no softness now, only resolve worn sharp by grief. "We mark them." "How?" someone asked. "Scars fade," another said. "They cover them." "Not scars," Louisa replied. "Memory." They began to teach one another how to remember. Songs altered slightly so names were hidden in rhythm. Counting games where dates were disguised as numbers. Marks made on beams, beneath floorboards, inside hems. Proof not meant for white eyes. Meanwhile, resistance drew consequences. On a plantation downriver, a woman named Esther refused to release her child. When the men came, she bit one hard enough to draw blood. The crack of the gunshot echoed across the fields. They buried her without ceremony. The baby vanished before dawn. Word spread quickly. Fear followed. But so did something else. Anger. In the city, Eliza watched the children of white families pass her in the street. She studied faces. The curve of a cheek. The color of hair catching light. Sometimes her breath would catch painfully, her body remembering before her mind could stop it. "She yours?" another woman once asked softly. Eliza did not answer. She could not. Above them, the men adjusted. They increased patrols. Restricted movement. Forced births to happen under supervision. Midwives were warned. "You answer to us," one overseer said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not them." The midwife nodded. She had learned when nodding was safer than truth. Yet even she began to falter. During a birth in January, she delayed. Claimed complications. Bought time with false urgency. The baby was taken anyway, but not before the mother pressed her lips to the child's ear and whispered a name that would never appear on paper. That name would survive. In a townhouse near the quarter, Duval entertained guests. Wine flowed. Laughter filled the room. Someone mentioned the rumors. Exaggerations, Duval said lightly. People love stories. But there have been many adoptions, a woman said. Unusual ones. Duval smiled. Providence favors the city. He did not mention the ledger locked in his study. The one with annotations in the margins. The one that tied everything together. What he did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that a copy existed. A young enslaved man tasked with cleaning offices at night had learned to read by candlelight. He had seen the names, copied them slowly, carefully onto scraps he hid beneath his shirt. He did not yet understand their full meaning, only that they were dangerous. One night, he passed them to Celeste without a word. She unfolded the paper in the dark, her hands shaking. Dates, initials, codes. She recognized Eliza's mark. Her knees buckled. She sat hard on the dirt floor, breath coming in short gasps. They kept count, she whispered. Like cattle. Ruth crouched beside her. Then we count too. From that night on, they shared information deliberately. Who was close to birth? Which doctor was coming? Which men arrived first? They learned patterns. They learned weaknesses. Not all resistance survived. Some women were sold away before they could act. Some broke under pressure and silence returned to their voices. But others endured. One night, a baby was hidden in a laundry cart and moved across the city before dawn. The mother was whipped when the absence was discovered. She never cried out. The child would grow somewhere else, alive. It was not victory. It was defiance. And defiance, once proven possible, spread faster than fear. By February, the system began to strain. Too many delays. Too many complications. Too many eyes watching the watchers. Men who had once spoken confidently now argued behind closed doors. This is becoming unstable, one said. No, another replied. This is becoming visible. Visibility was the true threat. Because the mothers had begun to understand something the city had long forgotten. Silence could be broken. And when it was, no amount of ink would be enough to cover what followed. By March of 1839, the whispers had climbed out of kitchens and quarters and found their way into parlors where the curtains were clean and the floors shone. They arrived disguised as concern, as curiosity, as polite confusion voiced over porcelain cups and sugared pastries. Have you noticed, a woman asked during a morning call on Royal Street, how many foundlings there seem to be this year? Her companion adjusted her gloves. New Orleans attracts misfortune. And mercy. Yes, the first said. But still, they all seem so similar. The word hung there. Similar to whom was never spoken. Men noticed too, though they framed it differently. In counting houses and offices, in the back rooms of taverns where deals were discussed away from wives and windows, questions began to surface. You hear about Duval's arrangements? One asked. I hear he is making himself indispensable. Indispensable men attract attention. So do profitable ones. At St. Louis Cathedral, Father Moreau stood at the pulpit and spoke of order, of God's design, of the dangers of questioning providence. His voice echoed against stone, solemn and reassuring. In the pews, heads bowed. What none of them knew was that the parish books no longer matched one another. Dates conflicted. Names appeared twice, then vanished. Annotations disagreed. The careful symmetry of record-keeping had begun to warp under its own lies. A clerk noticed first. He was a quiet man, unremarkable, valued for his neat handwriting and his discretion. One afternoon, while cross-referencing birth and baptismal registers, he frowned. This cannot be right, he murmured. A child baptized in November appeared nowhere in the birth ledger. Another appeared twice, once under a woman's name, once under none at all. He brought the issue to his superior, who listened patiently and then closed the book with a decisive snap. Do not trouble yourself with this, the man said. Certain matters are handled elsewhere. Elsewhere where? The superior smiled thinly. Above your pay. The clerk did not ask again. But he did not forget. In drawing rooms, white women began to compare notes. Not openly, not yet, but in the way that women have always done, through half-sentences, through questions posed as jokes. My Clara has the oddest eyes, one said. No one in either family. Children change, another replied quickly. God's hand is mysterious. Yes, of course. Some accepted the explanation eagerly. Others felt a quiet unease they could not name. It surfaced at night, when the house was still and the child slept, when a face in candlelight seemed unfamiliar. In a townhouse near Canal Street, a woman confronted her husband. She does not look like us, she said. He sighed. You wanted a child. I wanted truth. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low. There are things you do not want to know. The next morning, the woman attended church and prayed harder than she ever had before. Meanwhile, in offices and counting rooms, men debated strategy. This attention is dangerous, one said. It will pass, Duval replied. It always does. What if it does not? Duval leaned back. Then we redirect it. How? With noise. With scandal elsewhere. With the appearance of morality. Plans were made. Articles commissioned that spoke of benevolence. Donations to orphanages increased. Priests were encouraged to preach about charity. The city applauded itself. Below that applause, the women watched. Celeste listened as the cook repeated gossip overheard at market. They say some woman accused a doctor. Ruth snorted. And they say she was sold the next day. Louisa's mouth tightened. That is not justice. That is fear. They afraid of us now? A younger woman asked. Celeste considered the question. No. They afraid of being seen. Visibility had crept into places it was never meant to reach. The system relied on silence, on fragmentation, on keeping each woman isolated within her own suffering. What unnerved white society was not a single accusation but the sense that stories were aligning. Patterns frightened people who depended on exception. In April, a newspaper editor received an anonymous letter. It spoke in careful language, offered no names, only numbers. Births, baptisms, transfers. He read it twice, then burned it. The next day he ran a story about river pirates. Yet even burned letters leave ash. In the French Quarter, a free man of color named Joseph began to notice children who resembled one another too closely to be coincidence. He said nothing at first. He had learned caution early. But he started to watch. In the slave quarters, news of the white world's discomfort spread quickly. They arguing, Ruth whispered one night. I heard it through the wall. About what? About us. A bitter laugh rippled through the group. They finally see us. Celeste shook her head. They see their reflection. What none of them yet understood, what the men arguing behind closed doors could not fully grasp, was that once a system draws attention to itself, it cannot retreat unchanged. Every additional lie requires more effort. Every erased name demands another erasure. And erasures leave gaps. By late spring, those gaps had begun to form a shape. One enslaved woman, newly arrived from upriver, watched the city with a stillness that unsettled even the others. She asked questions sparingly. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was precise. How many? She asked one night. Celeste met her eyes. More than they admit. The woman nodded once. Then it is enough. What is? She did not answer. She only looked toward the river, where fog curled low and patient, hiding paths that others believed were gone forever. What they did not know was that she remembered everything. They called her Miriam, though that was not the name she had been born with. That name had been taken from her years earlier, folded into some other man's inventory and forgotten. Miriam was the name she used now because it was short, because it drew no attention, because it sounded like obedience. She arrived in New Orleans on a flatboat at the end of April, when the river ran high and fast, swollen with spring rains. She did not look like much, thin, quiet, eyes lowered, but there was something in the way she stood that unsettled people. Not defiance. Awareness. She listened. On her first night in the quarters, she said very little. She watched the women's faces as they spoke, the pauses between sentences, the way certain names were avoided and others repeated. When someone mentioned a baby taken weeks before, Miriam's head lifted just slightly. How old? She asked. Newborn, Ruth said. Why? Miriam nodded once. And before that? The women exchanged glances. Celeste answered carefully. Another. Month earlier. And before that? Silence. Louisa studied her. Why you asking? Miriam met her eyes. Because this has happened before. The women leaned in. Where? Someone whispered. Virginia, Miriam said. Along the James. Smaller. Quieter. They thought it would stay hidden. What happened? They moved the women. Changed the routes. Thought that would end it. And did it? Miriam shook her head. No. It only delayed it. From that night on, Miriam became stillness itself. She worked where she was told, spoke when required, and vanished into the background whenever possible. Men did not notice her. That was her gift. What they did not know, what they would come to fear, was that Miriam was counting. She counted births. Counted nights when doctors arrived unexpectedly. counted how long it took for babies to disappear. She memorized names and dates, repeating them in her mind until they were fixed beyond erasure. Celeste noticed first. "You do not ask what happens," she said one evening. "You already know." Miriam did not deny it. Knowing is safer than guessing. Why? Because guessing leads to hope. That frightened Celeste more than anger would have. In the weeks that followed, Miriam began to speak to women individually, never in groups. She asked simple questions. When did your bleeding stop? Who was near you then? What did the midwife say? She never wrote anything down. She did not need to. What she did not tell them, what the narrator knows now, was that Miriam had learned to survive by remembering when she was very young. Her first owner had believed forgetting was obedience. Miriam had learned otherwise. By May she could predict outcomes. "That one will be taken," she said quietly one night, nodding toward a woman whose time was near. "How you know?" Ruth asked. "They have already prepared the papers." The baby was gone before sunrise. Fear spread, but so did trust. "She knows," women began to whisper. Miriam did not encourage it. She did not discourage it either. Meanwhile, the men sensed a shift they could not identify. "There is a woman asking questions," an overseer said. "All of them ask questions," another replied. "Not like this." Duval dismissed it at first. Questions do not change outcomes. But he noticed something else too. Deliveries were being delayed. Babies moved unexpectedly. Information traveled faster than it should have. Someone was organizing memory. That frightened him. In the quarters, Miriam spoke to Celeste late one night while the others slept. "They are close to breaking," Miriam said. Celeste laughed bitterly. "They do not break." "Everything breaks," Miriam replied. "The question is where. And then what?" Miriam looked toward the river. "Then the truth escapes." "How?" "There is a night coming," Miriam said. "A night when they will rush. When too many men will arrive too quickly. When the system will show its seams." "And the babies?" Miriam's jaw tightened. "Some will be lost." The words landed heavily. "And the mothers?" "Some will die." Celeste swallowed. "Then why?" "Because if nothing happens," Miriam said softly, "this will never end." What Celeste did not know, what none of them could know yet, was that Miriam had already chosen the night. By June the city was restless. Gossip flared and faded. Records piled up. Men slept poorly. On a plantation near the river, Miriam stood beneath the stars and listened to the sound of boots approaching in the distance. She closed her eyes and ran through the names one last time, fixing them in place. This was not grief. It was preparation. And when the night came, when the system moved too fast and trusted itself too much, it would collide with something it had never accounted for. A woman who remembered everything and refused to forget. The night came without ceremony. No storm announced it. No bell warned the city. The heat lingered, heavy and wet, pressing breath from lungs. Cicadas sang as if nothing waited in the dark. New Orleans slept believing itself intact. By midnight, 3 men had already arrived at the quarters upriver. Not together. That was the first mistake. They came in pairs, then singly, boots scuffing dirt they assumed was empty of memory. Miriam stood in shadow, her back against the rough wall, counting footsteps. Too early. She said nothing. Inside a nearby cabin, a woman named Sarah labored silently, her teeth clamped down on a folded rag. Celeste knelt beside her, hands slick with sweat, whispering rhythm and breath. "Not yet," Celeste murmured. "Wait." Outside, a lantern bobbed closer. Too soon. A man's voice cut the air. "We were told." "Not yet," the midwife said sharply from the doorway. "Unless you want a dead child." The man hesitated. He cursed under his breath and stepped back. Miriam exhaled slowly. She moved. Across the yard, Ruth slipped from one shadow to the next, carrying a bundle that did not cry. A baby born an hour earlier, skin darker, spared, tonight. The plan had never been to save everyone, only to disrupt the machine. Then a shout rang out from the far end of the quarters. "Hey!" The sound cracked the night open. Boots pounded. A lantern fell and shattered. Light flared wild and uneven. Miriam did not run. She stepped forward. The overseer spotted her first. "Where you going?" "Nowhere," she said. He raised his hand to strike her. The knife flashed. It was not a large blade. It did not need to be. Miriam drove it into his thigh, precise, practiced. He screamed and went down hard, clutching blood. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then chaos erupted. Men shouted orders that collided with one another. Someone fired a pistol into the air. Women screamed, not in fear but warning. Doors slammed. Feet ran. In the cabin, Sarah cried out as the baby came, sudden and fast. The midwife swore softly. "Get her up," Celeste said. "Now." The door burst open. A man lunged inside, eyes wild. He reached for the child. Celeste grabbed a poker from the hearth and swung. It caught him at the jaw with a sickening crack. He went down, stunned but alive. "No mercy," Miriam said from the doorway. "Not tonight." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. More men arrived. Too many. Just as Miriam had predicted. They rushed. They pushed. They tripped over one another in the dark. Orders lost in the din. Someone dragged a woman by the hair. Another struck a man who was not resisting. And in that confusion, the system showed its seams. Records were not where they were meant to be. Babies were not where the list said they should be. Women moved where they were not expected to move. In the counting house in the city, Duval jolted awake as church bells rang, too early, too frantic. He dressed hurriedly, his heart pounding with an instinct he did not yet understand. By the time he reached the plantation, the night was already bleeding into morning. 2 men lay injured. One would die before noon. A cabin smoldered, its roof collapsed inward. No one would ever say who lit the fire. No one could say for certain it was intentional. That ambiguity would save many lives. Miriam stood with her hands bound at dawn, her face calm, her eyes clear. Blood streaked her sleeve, not her own. They dragged her forward. "You planned this," Duval said when he arrived, breathless, furious. Miriam looked at him steadily. "You did." He struck her. She did not flinch. "What did you hope to accomplish?" he demanded. She said nothing. What he did not know, what none of them realized yet, was that the night had already done its work. Not because of the injuries, not because of the fire, but because witnesses existed. Men who had seen too much. Women who would never forget. Children who had survived because the system hesitated for the first time. By midday, cover stories were already forming. A disturbance, a misunderstanding, an unfortunate outbreak of violence among the enslaved. Records would be altered. Again. Miriam was sold south before the week ended. Her name would vanish from the books entirely. But the knowledge she planted did not leave with her. In the quarters that night, the women sat in silence, exhausted, bruised, alive. Celeste held Sarah's child and whispered the name Miriam had taught her to remember. Outside, the river kept moving. And New Orleans, for the first time, understood it had lost control of something it had never believed could fight back. By the following morning, the city had decided what had happened. It was not the truth, but it was neat, and that was what mattered. A disturbance, officials said. A breakdown in discipline. An unfortunate convergence of heat, drink, and agitation among the enslaved. The injured men were victims of disorder. The fire had been accidental. Nothing more. Duval stood in a back room of the parish office, his coat draped over a chair, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. Around him, men spoke quickly, overlapping one another in anxious bursts. "We must move them," one said. "Immediately." "How many?" "All of them who were present." "And the women?" "Especially the women." A clerk cleared his throat. "There will be questions." "There will always be questions," Duval snapped. "Our task is to ensure they are asked somewhere else." By noon, sales were arranged. Not openly, not advertised. Quiet transfers south and west, plantations where faces were unfamiliar and memories unwelcome. Names were crossed out. Destinations altered. Bills of sale stamped and sealed with practiced indifference. Miriam's name did not appear at all. "She was never here," Duval said flatly when the clerk hesitated. The clerk obeyed. In the quarters, the aftermath unfolded with a brutality that required no spectacle. Women were separated without explanation. Children were pulled from arms and handed to men who would not meet their eyes. Some resisted. Some went limp. None were allowed farewell. Celeste watched Ruth disappear down the road, her hands bound, her head held high. Their eyes met once. "Remember?" Ruth called. Celeste nodded. By nightfall, the quarters felt hollowed out. Empty spaces yawned where voices had been. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. In the city, the cover story spread efficiently. The newspaper printed a brief notice about unrest swiftly resolved. Church leaders preached about obedience and harmony. Dinner tables echoed with reassurance. "It was exaggerated," one man said. "These things happen." "Yes," his wife replied, rocking the child in her arms. "We are fortunate it was contained." Contained. No one mentioned the babies. Yet even the best cover stories leave seams. In a house near the river, a woman named Mrs. Beaumont stared at the infant sleeping beside her. The child's breathing was soft, regular. In daylight, her skin looked less pale than it had weeks ago. Or perhaps Mrs. Beaumont had only imagined the paleness to begin with. "You are ours," she whispered. "You must be." The child did not stir. Across town, Father Moreau locked the baptismal register in his drawer and did not open it for 3 days. When he did, he found that 2 pages had been removed. He said nothing. He told no one. He began to drink more than was wise. In the quarters, Celeste gathered what remained of the women late one night. They did not light a fire. They did not sing. "They think it is finished," someone said. "It is finished for them," Celeste replied. "Not for us." Louise's voice trembled. "They took my sister." "I know. They took her child too." Celeste closed her eyes. She could still hear Miriam's voice. "Come. Certain. Memory is a weapon. They will try to scatter us," Celeste said. "To make us forget." A young woman shook her head fiercely. "I will not." "Neither will I," another said. Names were spoken softly. Dates repeated. Marks recalled. The women committed everything to memory, knowing paper could be burned but minds could not be so easily erased. In the weeks that followed, the system tightened its grip. Fewer births were allowed to happen unobserved. Doctors were rotated. Midwives replaced. The process resumed, quieter now, more careful. Babies continued to vanish. But something had changed. Men hesitated where they had not before. They double-checked lists. They argued over details. They slept less soundly. Because somewhere between the fire and the forced sales, certainty had cracked. Witnesses existed. Not the kind who could testify in court. Not the kind whose words would be printed. The kind who remembered. Years later, historians would argue about whether the disturbance of 1839 truly disrupted anything. Records suggested order was quickly restored. Profits did not noticeably decline. The city moved on. But in private correspondence, in marginal notes, in sudden relocations and unexplained disappearances, traces remained. The cover story had worked, mostly. Yet every lie requires maintenance. And as time passed, maintaining this one would demand more effort than anyone had anticipated. Because the children were growing. And blood, no matter how carefully disguised, has a way of resurfacing. By summer's end, New Orleans would congratulate itself on stability. What it did not know, what it could not yet see, was that the truth had already escaped. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be found. Time did what it always did in New Orleans. It softened the edges, rounded the story, turned sharp truths into anecdotes suitable for polite conversation. By the mid-1840s, the disturbance of 1839 was remembered, if it was remembered at all, as a brief moment of disorder in an otherwise well-managed system. The city prospered. Cotton prices rose. Sugar flowed. Riverboats came and went with their usual rhythm. And the children grew. In a white-clapboard house north of the quarter, a boy named Thomas stood before a mirror and studied his face. He was 12 years old enough to notice things. The shape of his mouth. The curve of his nose. How little he resembled the man who called himself father. "You staring at yourself again?" the man asked from the doorway. Thomas flushed. "No, sir." "Get ready. We are late." At church, Thomas felt eyes on him. Sometimes approving. Sometimes searching. He did not know why. He only knew that he was watched more closely than other boys, praised more carefully, corrected more sharply. "Stand straight. Mind your tone. You are fortunate." Fortunate was a word he heard often. He did not know what it was meant to compensate for. Across town, a girl named Clara learned piano. Her fingers moved easily over the keys, drawing praise from guests who smiled at her talent. "She has such a gift," one said. "Where does it come from?" Her mother's smile tightened. "God." At night, Clara dreamed of water. Of hands pulling her away from something warm and dark. She woke crying and could not explain why. In the quarters, what remained of them, the women aged. Lines deepened around eyes. Backs bent. Some were sold. Some died. Some endured. Celeste stayed. She carried memory like a second spine. She repeated names to herself while she worked. While she slept. While she watched children who were not hers walk past with faces too familiar to ignore. Once at market, she saw a boy whose eyes mirrored Eliza's exactly. Her breath caught painfully in her chest. "Eliza," she whispered, though the woman herself had been sold years before. The boy laughed at something his mother said and kept walking, unaware of the gaze burning into him. Celeste went home and marked another line beneath the floorboard. In the city offices, men retired. New men took their places. Some records were lost to fire. Others were deliberately misfiled. The system evolved, adapted, survived. But not unchanged. Doctors who had participated too closely developed habits that alarmed their families. Drinking. Isolation. Sudden relocations. One was found dead in his study, a bottle overturned beside him. His papers were burned by his widow before anyone else could read them. Duval aged quickly. His hair thinned. His temper shortened. He slept poorly. When he walked the streets, he sometimes thought he saw Miriam's face in passing crowds. He never spoke of her. One evening, a young clerk approached him hesitantly. "Sir," he said, "there is a discrepancy in the old ledgers." Duval looked up slowly. "There are many discrepancies. This one repeats." Duval closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were cold. "Correct it." The clerk swallowed. "I already tried." That was when Duval understood something irreversible had happened. The truth had fragmented. It existed in too many places now. In too many minds. It could not be fully gathered again. By the 1850s, rumors surfaced occasionally. A white man accused of having a black mother. A woman whose parentage was questioned after an argument. A sudden silence when certain topics arose at dinner tables. Families closed ranks. The city closed ranks. Yet cracks showed. A free man of color named Joseph kept notes for years. He did not publish them. He did not share them widely. He hid them carefully, waiting. In the quarters, younger women asked questions. "Why do you remember all this?" one asked Celeste. "Because they want us not to," she replied. "Does it matter now?" Celeste looked at the girl. "It always matters." In 1861, war came. The world broke open in ways no one in 1839 could have predicted. Records were destroyed. Houses abandoned. Families scattered. And in that chaos, pieces of the truth slipped free. Years later, long after emancipation, long after the city pretended to have reinvented itself, historians would stumble upon contradictions they could not fully explain. Baptismal entries without births. Children whose origins vanished into silence. Marginal notes written in hands that no longer had names. They would argue, debate, publish cautious papers filled with footnotes and uncertainty. What they would never fully capture was the cost. The mothers who waited. The children who felt something missing but could not name it. The women who carried memory when paper failed. New Orleans would tell itself it had survived intact. But beneath that story lay another, fragmented, buried, but persistent. A story that refused to stay erased. Long after the city rebuilt its pride and repainted its facades, long after the war stripped slavery of its legal authority but not its consequences, the truth began to surface the way it always does, by accident. In 1898, a junior archivist named Edwin Hale was tasked with cataloging parish records damaged by humidity and neglect. He worked alone in a narrow room behind the main archive, the air thick with mildew and dust. He was meticulous by nature, the sort of man who believed order could be restored to anything if one worked slowly enough. On a humid afternoon, he noticed something peculiar. 2 baptismal records. Same date. Same priest. Same margin mark. Only one corresponding birth. Hale frowned. He cross-referenced another year. Then another. The pattern emerged reluctantly, as if the books themselves resisted exposure. Children who appeared fully formed in the record. No mothers. No origins. No explanation beyond vague notes. Found, surrendered, circumstances unknown. He marked them carefully. By the end of the week, he had counted 37. "What are you doing?" his supervisor asked when Hale requested additional ledgers. "Trying to understand," Hale replied. "Understanding is not your task," the man said sharply. "Preservation is." Hale nodded. He continued anyway. Elsewhere, a woman named Clara Beaumont, no longer a child, now a widow, stood before her family's old papers with a growing sense of unease. Her husband had died the previous year, leaving behind debts and documents she had never been meant to see. Among them was a receipt. Not for property. For silence. The amount was significant. The date unmistakable. She sat heavily in a chair, her heart pounding. Memories rose unbidden. Her mother's careful distance, her father's sudden anger when questions were asked, the way servants had watched her with eyes too knowing to be accidental. That night, Clara stood before a mirror and studied her face again, just as she had as a girl. This time she did not look away. In a modest house beyond the city, Joseph, older now, slower, unwrapped a bundle of papers he had protected for decades. Notes written in pencil. Names repeated across years. Observations made quietly, patiently. He had waited for this moment. "These records are incomplete," he wrote in a letter he never sent. "But the pattern is unmistakable." He placed the papers back in their hiding place. The world was not ready yet. But it would be. Meanwhile, descendants lived with questions they could not answer. A man denied inheritance because of a rumor. A woman cut off after a quarrel revealed too much. Families fracturing over whispered accusations that no one dared investigate fully. In one case, a white man petitioned the court to have his lineage officially recognized after discovering a birth record that did not align with his baptism. The petition was denied without explanation. The record disappeared shortly thereafter. History corrected itself, or tried to. By the early 20th century, scholars began to notice irregularities they could not ignore. They wrote carefully, avoiding conclusions that might provoke outrage. They used words like anomaly and ambiguity. They spoke of social complexity. They did not speak of theft. In the margins of one surviving ledger, a single line appeared in a different hand, written years after the fact. These children were taken. No one could identify the author. In the quarters, now long dismantled, there would repurposed or rotted away. Memory lingered only in fragments passed down through families who had learned to survive by remembering quietly. A grandmother told a story to a child about a woman who counted names in the dark. A lullaby included words that did not quite make sense. A scar was touched reverently and never explained. The city of New Orleans continued to celebrate itself. Its music, its resilience, its mysteries. But beneath those stories lay another, less convenient one. A story written not in ink alone, but in bodies, in absence, in lives that diverged sharply from the truth they were owed. What historians would eventually accept, though they could never fully prove, was that something deliberate had occurred. Something organized. Something profitable. And what they would never fully recover were the names. The mothers who whispered them. The children who were never allowed to hear them. The woman who remembered everything, whose voice had been sold away but not silenced. History had tried to bury the truth beneath paperwork in time. It had failed. Because memory, once passed forward, does not belong to the past anymore. It waits. And it resurfaces when the world is finally forced to look. By the time the 20th century settled into its stride, New Orleans had learned how to speak about the past without naming it. The city favored romance over reckoning. Music over memory. Tour guides spoke of grandeur and grace, of old families and elegant homes, while the spaces where the quarters once stood were paved, renamed, or forgotten entirely. And yet, the story did not vanish. It lived on in silences that fell too quickly, in family trees that stopped abruptly, in questions asked once and never again. A woman in Baton Rouge refused to let her daughter marry into a prominent family after seeing a baptismal certificate that raised doubts she could not articulate. A man in Mississippi destroyed letters left by his father, afraid of what they implied. Entire generations grew up sensing a fracture in their lineage, a wrongness that could not be proven but could not be ignored either. The children who had been sold as white carried it quietly. Some never suspected. Others did and learned early that suspicion was dangerous. A few went looking anyway, tracing names that dissolved beneath their fingers, following paper trails that led only to blank spaces and polite refusals. Those who asked too loudly were dismissed. Those who persisted were isolated. The mothers, those who survived, died with their knowledge intact. They passed it on not as accusation but as instruction. Remember, they said, not for justice, not for revenge, for truth. Because truth, they understood, does not always arrive as vindication. Sometimes it arrives simply as recognition, as the quiet understanding that what was taken had existed, that what was erased had mattered. Historians would continue to debate. Some would argue coincidence. Others would argue social ambiguity. A few would come close to naming the thing itself, only to pull back at the last moment, constrained by missing records and professional caution. But among themselves, in private correspondence and late-night discussions, they acknowledged what the evidence suggested. This had not been chaos. It had been policy. A system that recognized whiteness as property. A market that understood blood could be reassigned. A city that decided motherhood could be revoked when profit demanded it. And at the center of it all were women whose bodies had been watched, measured, and ultimately overridden by men who believed paperwork could undo reality. The woman named Miriam never appeared again in any surviving record. Her final destination was never documented. Her death was never confirmed. But her work endured, because she had understood something essential, that systems depend on forgetting, and that memory, once shared, becomes unmanageable. New Orleans never issued an apology. No official inquiry ever traced the children back to the women who birthed them. No monument marked the absence. Yet absence itself became a kind of testimony. Every ledger with a missing line. Every baptism without a birth. Every family story that ended mid-sentence. These were not accidents. They were the remnants of a choice the city made and hoped no one would ever revisit. But history is not passive. It waits. It waits in archives and attics, in songs altered just enough to survive, in the discomfort that flares when certain questions are asked at dinner tables generations later. And when it surfaces, it does not ask permission. So now the question returns to us. What do you think really happened to those children who were sold into whiteness? Do you believe the mothers ever stopped waiting for them? And if the truth had been fully uncovered sooner, would anyone have listened? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more dark historical mysteries like this, stories buried on purpose, voices silenced by design, subscribe to the Slave Rebellion. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story, and share this video with someone who believes history should be confronted, not softened. These stories were erased for a reason. They survived for a reason too. And as long as they are remembered, the silence never fully wins.